Welcome race fans to the first new player live Q&A of 2025. One of many planned. If you're in a league and you know that there's new players in it and they're not on this show today, make sure and tell them that there will be more of these. There's one tomorrow, there's one the next day, getting us prepared for the first IndyCar race this weekend. And then we're probably going to have another 3 or more planned shows coming up for the start of F1. So make sure to get in on it. Before we get going, some quick introductions. My name is Ross. I'm the founder and CEO of Grid Rival. With me today, I have Michael Ursinoli, our CTO, one of our principal software engineers, William Laddie, and our business operations director, Ryan Booth, to help you with all of your new player questions. Main goal of the call is to answer your questions about gameplay, how the game works, how fantasy points work, what the main purpose and the goal of the game is, and how to beat your friends. And any questions any of you US-based players might have about our picks game. We're not going to try to get into as much of new features, product roadmap of Grid Rival. We will try and answer them if they're there and we have time. But mostly this is about getting you set up successfully to compete in your league if you're a first-time player on Grid Rival. Also, a quick shout out, new for 2024. IndyCar is on Grid Rival for the first time in our leagues product. We, of course, had it last year in our picks game. And more excitingly, we are the official fantasy app for IndyCar this year. So we're really excited about that. The game, as many of you may seen, is sponsored by Firestone. So a quick shout out to the Firestone team for sponsoring the Fantasy Challenge. And for any of you that don't know, the way that game works is basically by joining any league on their Grid Rival game, whether it's a league that you create and host amongst your friend, or whether it's official IndyCar league, you are automatically entered into the Firestone Challenge. The winner at the end of the season gets a VIP Indy 500 experience next season. So exciting stuff. Go ahead if you have questions and start getting them in the chat. While you do that, we are going to get into, as a couple of folks who've been running this game for a few years, generally speaking, some of the most common questions and mistakes that new players make fall into about 5 or 6 categories. So as we wait for the Q&A to start, we're going to go ahead and walk you through some of the most common mistakes we see new players in fantasy leagues make. And the first one is pretty basic. It is not watching the game guide or not finding the game guide. The game guide can be found in any league by clicking the gear icon on the top right, and there's a big green or blue button, I can't remember the color, that says game guide. And in that game guide, there's 4 videos that are about 90 seconds long that kind of explain in detail how to play the game and the basics. And so the biggest recommendation we have for new players out the gate is make sure to spend a couple minutes and watch the game guide. It'll help you get up to speed really quickly on exactly how to play throughout the season. The second one, and one of the longest answers we have on our side, is failing to understand that the importance of gaining money and increasing your fantasy team's value during the season. So I think we probably all conceptually understand that the way that you win your league and the way that you beat the other players in your league is by earning the most fantasy points. The way you get the most fantasy points is by having the most stacked team of the best drivers. And the way that you do that is by having the most amount of money to spend on drivers. But everybody starts the season with $100 million in fantasy budget, the same amount of money. So the question is, how do you get more? And there's one primary method, and there's only one method by which you do that in Grid Rivals Contracts league game. And the way you do that is by adding drivers to your team when they are a certain value and releasing them from your team when they have went up in value. So as an example, let's say we sign a driver for today, $14 million, and we add him to our team for 4 races. If he has 4 really great races, the likelihood is that after that period of time, his value would have went up, let's say, to 16 million. So when he gets released from your team, that $2 million arbitrage gets added back to your bank balance. So the next time you add a driver, you have $2 million extra to spend as you progress through the season. And if you compound that over, I don't know, call it 20, 50 driver changes throughout the season, a lot of times you'll see players at the end of the season who were really, really experienced with team values above 130, $140 million sometimes. And so over the season, one of the things you really need to be thinking about is driver pricing and looking at which drivers you might think are underpriced relative to how you expect them to perform. So that's a really big concept that people usually learn sometimes the hard way as they step into this the first year, but it's one of the most important things to grasp. The third is that fantasy points are not only equal to race finish position, because we and most people who do fantasy sports think that would be kind of boring, right? If the only thing that mattered was where the driver finished, kind of like if there's any fantasy football players here, right? If all you did in fantasy football was guess which team won the game, fantasy football wouldn't exist. What makes it fun is all the nuance of the different players and how they earn points. And so we tried to create a game that, although it is race finish position heavy, because that is the most important thing for a driver in any racing event, we have a lot of other ways that drivers can earn fantasy points. Qualifying position. Some of these are dependent on the sport, right? The scoring for IndyCar is not the same as NASCAR, is not the same for F1. But as an example, like I said, qualifying position, the number of net positions gained from a driver's qualifying position from their to their race position. So the total number of overtakes they make during the race, whether or not they beat their teammate, or in IndyCar, if they are the highest ranked driver on their team, right? They earn fantasy points for that. Another one is laps led in series like NASCAR, right? Really, really important to that sport. Also, stage finish positions. We have something that applies in most of our leagues called, excuse me, improvement points. And what we do there is we measure a driver's 8 race average finish position, at least in the Formula One game. And we basically say if they finish above their 8 race average, and by what amount, we'll award fantasy points. So there are a lot of different ways that fantasy points are earned. And it's really important to remember that. And the way that we see this usually creating confusion for new players is some driver will finish in first place, but they may not get the most fantasy points. And so we'll get a lot of requests. Why didn't this guy get the most points? He won. And it's probably because somebody who maybe was in sixth place finished second and had a really, really good event. He was the best on his team. He maybe had a couple overtakes. And so he accomplished more in the event that accumulated fantasy points than maybe a driver who's qualified first and finished first. So that's number 3. Number 4 is in our contracts game, signing all of the same length contracts. Very, very common thing we see amongst new players. So if you go into your league right now and you go to your My Team screen and you have 6 drivers and all of them have 3-race contracts or 4-race contracts or 5-race contracts, we're talking to you. And my team here, add in any commentary about why you think this is important, because there's a lot of nuance here. But one of the things you want to think through is you want to leave yourself options, right? If all of your if all of your team is signed for 4 races, that means 4 races from now your whole entire roster is going to clear, and you need to re-sign everybody. And we have something on the game, which is point number 5. So we'll talk about these kind of in sequence. We have something called the 1-race lockout rule. And that means after after a driver's contract is done, you can't sign them again for 1 race, right? Because what would be the point of a contract if you could just pick them right back up when they drop off? So in this circumstance, if you sign every single player on your team, right, for 3 races, 4 races, 5, whatever it is, your whole roster is going to clean out, and all 6 of those drivers will not be eligible to be added back to your team. So you also want to give yourself options throughout the season, right? Ideally, every single race weekend, you have options to add someone else to your team, right? If you see that somebody's on a discount, but if everybody's locked in and all your spots are locked in for the next 5 races, you won't have that optionality. Is there anything else you guys want to add here?
Yes, William. What is 6 races from now?
The 6th race of the IndyCar season is the Indianapolis 500.
So what does that mean? Yeah.
So that means that if you want to have somebody on your team for the Indy 500, you don't want to sign them for 5 races because you're going to have them blocked out for that 6th race, which is Indy. So plan accordingly as you figure out your contract lengths. Do I want somebody available at a particular track? If so, let's make sure that they're not on cooldown. And I saw a scoring question. Where do you find out who scores what points? Open up your league. Open up whichever sport you're in. Open up a league for that sport, and then press the gear, which is in the upper right corner, and then press scoring, and you can find out how points are scored in whatever sport you're interested in, be it F1, NASCAR, or IndyCar.
And if I can get one more thing in there, if you click this salaries tab next to the drivers tab for the for IndyCar, we actually publish the math for all of the value change calculations. I think we're one of the few fantasy apps that do that. So if you're like, hey, how did so and so, increase or decrease in this value? We actually give the exact math breakdown of how those drivers change in value. So you could do the math yourself. Any Excel nerds could do that as well. But I'm going to go back to just quickly something that Ross said in the beginning is I talk to a lot of players, and the key to the game is to not overcomplicate things. And it really is to pick the best race result you think from the drivers you could select with the budget you have. If you do that well, your team value will work itself out. Your contract lengths will come out in the wash over the course of the season, and you don't really have to worry about bonus points a ton. There are strategies to deploy to maximize all three things, but you don't need to go to that length all of the time. It's like if I'm competing against William or Ryan, not really competing against Ross, to be honest. um, I'm always looking ahead of them and saying like, okay, they're within 100 points of me. Maybe I could deploy a tactic to jump them by really focusing on the points. But I'm really thinking about how well do I know this sport, the drivers, and the upcoming races, and then I make my selections from there.
Yeah, very, very well said. And I if what you're hearing all at once sounds overwhelming, we promise it's not that complicated. You're going to get the hang of it very quickly. And the thing I would say too is like there's fantasy sports is all about camaraderie and community, to having fun with your friends. You don't need to master this, right, to enjoy the season. And you will get the hang of it really, really quickly. There's a level of depth for the people who really want to kind of obsess over exactly how long each driver should be on their team, and how to think about that based off of what type of track they're racing on this week versus next week. You don't need to do that to have a good experience and have fun and play with your friends. So Michael makes a great point.
Yes.
Yeah, and we could get in the weed. Yeah, we could get in the weeds all day about like contract length and how to do all of that. But it's just from its most basic level, it's you don't want everyone rolling off the same time, just like Ross had said. I mean, you look at F1, there's 20 drivers. If you have 5 of your drivers all for the same contract, not only are you stuck with them for however many races that is, but when they roll off, that's a quarter of the grid that you can't select for a single race. So it gives you no options, and options are everything in this game. And another tip is never have just one person rolling off on a given week, because then you're shoehorned into whatever that budget is. If you have 2 or more, you have a lot more options.
And Jessica asked in the chat, if you pick 6 drivers for one race, does that mean you can't pick them for the following race? That's right. If I pick all 6 drivers for one race, and I have them for St. Petersburg, I'm not going to have them for Thermal. They're going to be locked out. Then I can pick them up again for Long Beach, which is the 3rd race for IndyCar.
Mhm.
But yeah, whenever a driver's contract expires, or if you choose to drop them early, they're out for one race. You won't be able to pick them.
Yep. So it doesn't matter if it's a 1 race or a 5 race contract, you have a 1 race cooldown that you cannot select the drivers again. And that's a game mechanic on purpose, because you're taking the shorter and the longer contract lengths, you're taking on a lot of risk, right? You're committing to the driver for a long term, or you're trying to make a very, very short profit off of the value of the driver's performance for the next race. So you still get the same 1 race cooldown rule applied, 1 race or 5 races. That also kind of forces you to go through the drivers that are available to sign and have a different lineup, and have also everyone in your league is doing this. So not everyone can play Alex Palou every single race, or the Penske drivers, or the Chip Ganassi drivers, right? Everyone is having to cycle through different drivers. So that can give you a competitive edge. If the person who's first place in your league, it has a 1 race cooldown for 2 podium contending drivers, and you don't, you have an opportunity to possibly leapfrog them that week. So it's a competitive advantage to all.
Yep, well said. And only two more two final points on our leagues game. So if there are questions that folks have available, start getting them in the chat. Number 6, we want 1 through 5. Number 6 is forgetting to select a talent driver. What we call a talent driver in their app is any driver under a certain threshold. In Formula One, it's 18 million. In NASCAR, I believe it's 16. In IndyCar, it's 18. Correct. Any of those drivers that you add, what was that?
I think NASCAR's 18 as well.
Okay, so they're all 18. Any driver that you add to your team under that price point is eligible to be your talent driver for a given race. And unlike your contracts with your drivers, you can change your talent driver every single week. But one of the biggest mistakes we see is people just miss it. They don't see it. They don't see the drivers with the stars next to their name. All you got to do is tap that star to select your talent driver. If you don't have one on your team, you're going to get notifications about filling it out ahead of the race. There's also going to be a gigantic red flashing banner on your My Team screen that alerts you. But despite that, sometimes we still see people not filling or not selecting a talent driver. And it's a very, very important position on your team because it earns 2 times as many points. Another question we get related to talent drivers, oftentimes people try to build maybe a top heavy roster without one. And instead of, however they weight their budget, they try and maybe only fill 5 driver spots, but have like the top 3 drivers and then 2 other ones and then not have a talent driver. And for what it's worth, you have to have a full roster to be able to utilize one. So that's why this occasionally happens. It's never really worth it because you can't overcome the doubling of points that position typically earns. So always remember your talent driver at every single race. And again, you can change it from driver to driver, regardless of whether they're in contract. And then the last one is not necessarily a mistake, but something that we notice people don't necessarily always realize is that you can change your lineup for your drivers that are not locked in a contract. You can change your lineup as much as you want in between races. So let's say you sign 2 drivers. Let's say we're talking about IndyCar, which starts this weekend at St. Pete. Let's say you have 4 drivers on your roster that are going to be on your roster for, at least 3 races, but 2 you're only going to sign for 1 race. And after St. Pete, they're going to drop off. Those open spots, you can mess around with them as much as you want until the next race. They aren't locked in once you pick a driver. So open positions on your lineup can be changed as much as you want. And that means up until St. Pete, you can mess around with your lineup as much as you want, right? If you've already filled up 6 positions, you can change them, move it around to your heart's content, change contract lengths, remove drivers, add drivers up until lockdown for that race, which happens a couple minutes before green flag. So that is our official top mistakes. To get into some Q&A, I think there's not as much as I thought there would be, maybe because we're answering everything, but I know William got a couple
about values that we could discuss. Nicholas asked, does the money reset each race? So what happens is as contracts expire, you get that money back into your bank. If a contract expires and you have less than 100 million, we'll bring you back to that 100 million, just so that you always have the ability to put together some sort of a competitive roster. Mm-hmm. Leading into Wayne's question, if a driver's value decreases, do you lose the difference? Unfortunately, yes. If your driver ends up losing value during the contract, you're going to end up with less money in the bank. So that's the basics of values. And then Logan had a question: is there betting besides fantasy? So our fantasy leagues are completely free to play. We do have some real money gaming on the Great Arrival app available in certain states where we're able to offer those games, which are it's a picks-based game rather than fantasy leagues. And that's a lot of fun. If you're in one of those states, we would encourage you to give that a try as well. Yep. We've got those for a number of sports, about 7 or 8 different series, including IndyCar, NASCAR, F1.
Jamie B asked, can the app be downloaded to computer and sync with the phone app? It's probably a question for Michael. I think on iPhone, or I think on Apple, if you have a MacBook in the App Store, I do think that you can download Grid Rival.
Yeah.
I don't think it's our recommended. I'll just say we didn't build it for that experience.
Yeah. Don't put it in a support ticket. If you're doing that, it confuses the heck out of everyone from what you're seeing. So, but it does work. So you can do that. But don't put it in a support. If you're going to put in a support ticket, check it on your actual mobile app first. Jessica asked, what is the criteria of a driver needs to become a talent driver if they didn't start as one? So this is a topic I'm pretty passionate about. So I'll give my spiel on this. So I'm going to pull up the app right now. Marcus Ericsson's at 17.4 million. He is the top ranked talent driver eligible selection you could put on your lineup. If at St. Pete, Marcus Ericsson crushes it and he becomes worth 18.2 million, he is no longer talent driver eligible, even if he's on your contract, even if he's under contract on your team. Conversely, if you sign Christian Lundgaard, he's at 18.8 million. If you have him on your team under contract, he crashes at St. Pete, and for thermal, he's 17.9 million. You could sign him as a talent driver. So it works both ways, up and down. People could come down into talent driver eligibility, and people can go up outside of talent driver eligibility. That keeps it fair that everyone's selecting a talent driver under 18 million, regardless of if you had them under contract or not.
Yeah, and talent driver really is the most important part of roster construction. And it's important to look at, if there is someone like 18.2, they might, like, I wouldn't put them on your contract, like a one race contract, because, you know, if they drop below, you lost that value and now you're locked out of them when they are talent driver eligible. So you really want to take a close look at anyone in that 17 to 19 range, depending how you feel about that driver. And, you know, sometimes it's not worth it to roster somebody who's not talent driver eligible, but may become there. And yeah, same thing. It's, you know, if there's someone at 17.5, but you really like them, they probably won't be talent driver eligible the next race if you played your cards right. So contract length is extremely important for those talent driver, like those guys in the range that will cross over the threshold or under it.
Totally. And Nicholas said, so use all 100 million for every race. Just going to hit on one thing.
It's a good question.
It's a good question. So just when you're starting out with in IndyCar, let's go with St. Pete for right now, right? You have $100 million budget. The starting salaries are designed that you could build a competitive lineup with $100 million. Do not sweat it if you have $1, $2, $3, $4 million left over, because what you're trying to do is you're not trying to optimize for how much money you could spend. You're trying to put the best team together possible for the expected race result. If you think the best team that you could assemble, who's going to have the best results for St. Pete and beyond, is $96 million, leave $4 million in the bank. Doesn't matter. Like, if that's the best team you think, the best combination of drivers for the races you have coming up, don't worry about spending it. Here's my caveat. Don't leave 20 million in the bank. You did something wrong.
So the best lineup may not require that you spend 100 million, but it probably requires you spend more than 80 million, probably even more than 90 million. But there are a lot of great lineups that can be made on the cheap. And I would say that as you're picking drivers, especially in that talent tier, look for people who might be at a discount. Maybe they had a bad race or two, and or they're coming up to a track that's going to be good for them. Like an example I would give would be Connor Daly last year at Milwaukee. Like, he hopped in, I forget what team it was. Like, he hopped in the car and he put the thing on the podium. The car was like 20th in points, and he sticks it on the podium. You've just struck gold if you found that arrangement where you've got a cheap driver and they put up a great result. So don't discount those guys who are like single-digit millions. Like, those might be where the diamonds are.
We have a very good example of that coming up in NASCAR this weekend for anyone who follows that. Shane Van Gisbergen, not a top driver in terms of salary, but is by far the favorite to win the race on Sunday. So probably a very good deal there. And you don't see anything that drastic in F1 or Indy, but there certainly are examples that I would say mirror it, but not to the extent, but just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think that in NASCAR and IndyCar, we're going to see a lot more regular driver salary fluctuations hitting their maximum amounts. The maximum that a driver can move up or down in value from a single race is 2 million. And so because of what Ryan said, the differences in types. What was that?
1 million in NASCAR,
Sorry,
2 million in the other sports.
That's right. And so, because of some of the nuance that exists in NASCAR and Indy that doesn't necessarily exist in Formula One, meaning very, very different tracks, right? Super speedways and short tracks, right? There's a very different set of favored drivers, um, versus especially when you add in road courses in there to Ryan's point. Similar with IndyCar, right? They race on road races and they have ovals, so you're going to see a lot more of that in those two sports. Quick question from Wayne. I missed it at the beginning. Will you be doing another Q&A specific to F1? Be doing several of these new player Q&As. We have two more planned for this week, in earlier times, and then we will be doing a couple more the week ahead of F1. And then on F1, we will also most likely have a strategy review. So that's a call where we actually go through each of our lineups and talk about lineup construction and specifics about setting your lineup. So less geared towards new players and how to play the game and some of the basics. So that's something that I would expect the week before the Australian GP for any of F1 players.
Yeah. Steve wondering, do you have to pick 6 drivers each race? Technically, no, but it is very strongly recommended because you need to have a full lineup in order to have a talent driver that scores double points, which is really like having a 7th driver. So you tell me, would you rather have 7 drivers or would you rather have 5 drivers? 7 probably gives you a better chance at scoring a lot of points. And you find one of those eligible drivers that has a great day, they can score more points than the race winner sometimes.
Yeah, very much. Oftentimes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great question.
William, do you want to take the Indy qualifying question from Jessica?
So good question. So Jessica asked, will there be anything for qualifying during the Indy 500? Well, you have to pick 6 drivers for that as well as the race. We're not going to award points for Indy 500 qualifying. So you'll just pick your 6 drivers for the race. And like every other race, it won't lock until it's time for the race. So you'll know how they've qualified. And in fact, you can use that to your advantage. If somebody has a bad qualifying, whether it's this weekend or in May, and they have to start at the back, there's the potential that they can get a bunch of overtake points by improving on that qualifying position. And maybe that's somebody that you snag because they have that upside if you think they can make their way up to the front, which is probably easier to do at Indy than a street horse like St. Pete, but it is a consideration.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we're just going to award points for these 17 races this year.
And that is a little different from if any of the folks on this call previously played IndyCar's, their old game. They did award a different set of points for the Indy 500. On the grid rival contracts game is the same as every other race in terms of weight and points. Let's see. Logan said, sorry again with the betting questions. I know this is mainly fantasy. See on the app right now that you can bet on race position. Is that it? One race. Once race day is upon us, are there more options? So just a little terminology catch. This app isn't a betting app per se. It is a daily fantasy sports app. And I think you're asking about the different types of markets or options that are available. It depends on the sport. For Formula One, we will have a lot of different options, including on sprint weekends. You'll be able to make daily fantasy picks on sprint position. Michael, do you off the top of your head, Michael and Ryan, really? Well, I guess the three of you more than me know exactly what's planned in terms of new markets.
Actually, William should take it because William will give the exact answer that he wrote.
Yeah, so like there'll be some new stuff on the horizon. Qualifying, sprint qualifying for F1, sprint for F1, race positions. Also, we're toying with some other ideas like total pit stops, for example, and lead lap finishers, like how many cars finish on the lead lap. That's another one. And we are brainstorming some other ideas, and you may not see them available this weekend, but as we go through the season, we do intend to add a bunch of interesting things to make picks on, and
there will be
we look forward to offering that.
There will be no shortage of lines. Like for example, for an F1 sprint weekend, you'll be able to do better, worse positioning and matchups for sprint qualifying, the actual sprint, then race qualifying, and then the actual race. So there will be plenty of things for you all weekend long.
We may even offer some things on practice sessions as we go through the season.
Yeah, practice as well. Net positions gained, total number of pit stops, and then these are things we're also going to be crossing through with IndyCar as well. But just for St. Pete, we're doing race position only. But as soon as thermal, we might see some more stuff in the app available,
as well as for our other sports.
Yep.
Like we mentioned, we support some other things too. Daniel with a question: does anything disqualify a contract? I think that's what you mean, like an injury or not qualifying for the 500. Okay, so if a driver were disqualified from a race, they would score 0 points from that race. That's something that we see in NASCAR and F1. That's a lot less common with IndyCar. And there is a certain window where that would have to happen. So there was a situation last year where a few cars were disqualified from St. Petersburg weeks later. We wouldn't care about that for the purposes of our game. Like we say, like it's done with, like after a certain period for inspections, appeals, etc. So if you get disqualified, that would be an issue. Not qualifying for the Indy 500. So if you don't start the race, you don't score points for the race. Good news is the game doesn't lock until the Indy 500. So if somebody on your roster happens to be the odd driver out and not qualify, you can drop them and choose a driver who is in the field and would score points. And then you mentioned injury. I saved that for last for a reason. If you have a driver that's injured, if it's a short-term situation, what we would do is we would substitute them with whoever their replacement driver is, and that replacement would score points just like they were the original driver on your contract. If it were a longer term situation, like we know that they're going to miss a bunch of races, we would most likely choose to terminate that driver, refund your money, and then you're free to pick anybody else. So that's what happens there. So if a driver doesn't start the race, they don't score points. If it's an injury substitution, we can substitute, but like if the car doesn't start the race, you're not getting any points, or if they get disqualified, you're not getting any points. I hope that answers the question.
We got a question from Josh. I missed the beginning, so you may have to explain it again. Sorry, but I don't completely understand the contracts. Why would you sign someone to a multi-week contract instead of just going week by week? So that is a great question. It is a loaded question. And just so that I don't have to repeat it all by myself, I'm going to give one answer and then you guys can add in any other things that you think. So number one is because you want to leave options open on your roster, right? So Josh, for example, let's say if we looked at your team right now and every single driver had a 3-race contract, that means that 3 races from now, that whole roster is going to be wiped out. Everybody's going to drop off. And because of something that we have called the 1-race rule, which prohibits you from re-signing a driver that just dropped off, because there would really not be a point in a contract if you could immediately just sign the person back to your team. Because that rule, if you have all of them drop off at once, it means you're going to have 6 drivers completely locked out that you might want to have for a race. Conversely, it means that up until that 4th event, you will have no opportunity to change out your team unless you can release a driver early and you have to pay a penalty, which sometimes, if it's a driver that's priced up in the top third, 20 to 30 million, the penalty can be, $700,000, $800,000, $900,000. So it can be pretty hefty. So number one, I would sum it up as optionality. What would you guys add?
Yeah, I just want to jump in here because I have to drop off here in a second. But the big advantage of multi-race contracts over just going week to week really ties into building team value. If you have a longer term contract and that driver excels, you're going to build a lot more of your bankroll, which becomes extremely important as you get later in the season. Think about, would you rather be spending $140 million on your roster or 110? Like, do you want to be the Los Angeles Dodgers or the Oakland Athletics? Like, it doesn't guarantee you win, but the more money you have available to you, mostly the better off you're going to be. And the way to do that is to identify maybe drivers who are underpriced and are going to gain a fair amount of value over the course of a contract. And yeah, again, it's having options every single week is so important in this game. You don't want to be locked into the same drivers. You don't want to have too many drivers locked out any given race weekend. So yeah, managing those contracts. it is tough at the beginning, but it's something you get the hang of, and you see how the game functions, and you'll learn that contract length is by far the thing that I spend the most time on a week-to-week basis when I build my lineup, because it is, I can't overstate how important it is. But yeah, on that note, I do have to drop off. If you want to see more of me, which I don't think a lot of people do, but if you do, I'll be on the show tomorrow and the next day for the entire hour.
Yeah.
So good luck, guys, on the rest of the show. Don't give any advice I wouldn't give. And I'll see you guys tomorrow.
Thanks, Ryan.
I'll give a tactical example. This, because I think people want to hear the actual tactics, right? All right, so let's throw a driver out there and a contract length example, right? So I'm going to cherry pick Nolan Siegel. So Nolan Siegel's currently valued at 7.6 million. He's the lowest valued McLaren driver right now. There's a really good chance that there is a lot of upside for Nolan Siegel. So Nolan Siegel would be someone that right now I would be considering for a 5-race contract, because no offense to Nolan, love him, I don't think I want him for the Indy 500. You know, that's a high crash, high skill race. He is a rookie, but I would love to probably sign Nolan for a 5-race contract out the gate, so that I could ride his value train all the way up to the Indy 500. Now I've built a whole bunch of value. Now I can go pick, the person who I'm really going to be putting money into for the Indy 500, which is race 6. Here's another example, another tactical example. Let's just say, I'll throw a name out there. Say Connor Daly just crushes St. Pete quali, right? He's currently valued at 6.2 million. Do you think that outcome is going to happen week over week, or was it a one-off? If it's a one-off, I'm going to throw Connor Daly on a 1-race contract to hope to capitalize on 1 race of his contract value increase and profit off of that, and not worry about not having Connor on my lineup for thermal. That's how I would be looking at contract length suggestions. And also, when we're talking about contract length suggestions, like Ryan said, it's like the most important thing that he thinks of. Ryan's like one of the top 5 NASCAR players on our game. So
and to explain the contrast that this can have, Ryan and some of the other hardcore players, they're thinking about, if I'm sending a 4 race, what track are they racing on the 4th race? Is it a short track? Is it a road course? Is it a super speedway? I don't do any of that stuff, and I have plenty of fun on the game. I made the game. I came up with the rules. And so, you don't have to obsess over that level of detail if you don't want, but there is a level of depth to this game that allows you to do so. I think the thing I look at is exactly what Michael talked about. One of the most viewed screens for me personally in our app is the driver profile screen. If you tap on a driver, it opens their profile and there's a chart, and it shows a trend. It shows as the season starts, it shows a graph of their trending salary. I'm always looking at that. Nolan's a great example. If anybody followed practice, he had an outstanding practice, and we probably severely underpriced him. He's most likely going to have 4 to 5 races of going up and up in value. So he's an example of somebody who you could pick up on your roster for a long time and hope that he goes up. But in a different circumstance, let's say you saw somebody that was undervalued, but maybe only a little bit undervalued. I would be saying, okay, well, I'll probably put them on my team for 2 races or a single race if I wanted to take a risk.
The other thing is, by going multiple races with somebody who you think is underpriced, you do shield yourself from some volatility. Like, let's say I agree that Siegel is going to go to the moon over the next 5 races, but for some reason, I'm thinking shorter contracts. Well, what happens if somebody runs into him in St. Petersburg and he doesn't get to realize that value gain that week?
Yeah.
If I'm on a shorter term contract, I lose the ability to make that value back the next week. Whereas with a longer contract, I get a longer sample, and if he does live up to expectations, I'm going to reap the rewards.
Totally. All right. Last thing I'll say on it. No more questions yet. Keep throwing your questions in, people. We're firing on all cylinders. The number one person to not put on a 1-race contract for St. Pete is Alex Pillow. Like, there's so much risk in contract value loss for Alex right now for St. Pete. If you put him on a 1-race contract thinking, oh, he's not only a podium contender, he's potentially a race winner, there's not much value upside. in going with Pillow right now, or even Will Power.
And
Like
to
he basically
interject,
has to, like he
based off
basically
this,
has to win wire to wire. I'm sorry.
for sure, yeah. Going back to what we said at the beginning of the show, fantasy points are not just based off finish position. It's very possible that Alex Below could qualify first and finish first and not have the most fantasy points. It's not necessarily likely, but it's certainly possible. If somebody who qualified seventh made it all the way up to first and they got a ton of overtake points, they got a bunch of different other points that aren't finish position, it is possible that they could get highly ranked second, first, maybe even in fantasy points.
Like let's say Siegel podiums. He's
Yeah,
going to score a lot of improvement points from
For
where we
sure.
have him ranked.
Yep, absolutely. I think that's it for questions. So, the last thing I'll say, there's a couple questions about our picks game. We'll go over that really quick. That is a very, very simple game, right? Our league's game is designed to keep everybody engaged for the whole season, right? To make it fun from race to race. Picks game is, I would say, the learning curve is way, way smaller.
Yeah.
With our picks game, it's a single player game, right? So you're not necessarily playing with friends. It's a little bit less social, but you're playing with real money on the line. And basically, all you have to do is one of two types of things. You predict whether a driver is going to finish better or worse than a certain statistic that we put up. So let's say race finish position. If you go to the pick screen, you're going to see a number of different lines, is what they refer to. So, like at the top of the board for IndyCar, you see Alex Pillow race position 3.5. And basically, all you have to pick is I think he's going to get third or better, or I think he's going to get fourth or worse. So you just pick better or worse. The reason those numbers are sometimes in halves, like 3.5, is because if he finishes, or if it was a solid number like 3 and he finished exactly in 3, it would be what's called a push. So we want to avoid those ties when we can. But you're picking better or worse. And then there's also matchups. If you click the matchups tabs, you can see right now there's a couple head-to-head ones. Will Power versus Colton Herta head-to-head. Pato Award versus Scott McLaughlin with a little bit of spread. So you're just picking which one of those two drivers is going to finish better than the other one. And then the way the game works is you have to make at least 2 picks to play. And if you get both of them right, you win 3 times your money. And then you can make up to 8. And if by chance you get all 8 right, you win 100 times your money. And so that happens every single weekend, resets every weekend. There's multiple different event types. So we were talking about that earlier. Right now, it's just race position. We're going to start to see qualifying, overtakes, things like that. Also, what's cool about the picks game is you can combine sports, right? So if NASCAR, IndyCar, Formula One, Formula E, MotoGP are all racing on the same weekend, and you happen to be watching all of those and understand them at a depth enough where you're willing to put some skin in the game, you can make a 5-pick lineup with 1 pick from each of those sports, and play them all together. So fun game if you've never done it, if you've never played any sort of real money daily fantasy game, if you're a motorsports fan, we'd love to have you try it out and tell us what you think. Any final questions come through?
We did.
Oh yeah,
Daniel's got a question.
Yep.
Seems like less value in this situation for going contra to other members of your league versus last year's fantasy IndyCar platform, where picking the same drivers would lead to no real points changes. Well, if you have 2 identical lineups, if you and another player have the same lineup, you're going to score the same number of points.
Mhm.
That said, there are so many choices in this game that's less likely, just because there are 27 drivers to pick from, and as you run different drivers through the season, you're probably going to have different team values. So if you have the same lineup, you're going to score the same points, but that's unlikely. And a tool that you can use to help yourself do the opposite of somebody else would be the league adoption. So if
Mhm.
you open up a driver's details on our driver list, there is a stat called league adoption. It updates about every 5 minutes or so. That's what percentage of teams in your league have chosen that driver. So if it's somebody who only a few people have taken, whoever you're competing against probably isn't one of them.
Yeah, well
and
said.
if you stick, Daniel, if you stick through all of our YouTubes for all season, you'll hear me talk about contrarian plays a lot. It's a move that I do a lot to try and stay competitive, especially when it comes to picking talent drivers. If I see a driver who has a very low league adoption and is talent driver eligible, I get a little thirsty to go after that opportunity because that leads me to get potentially points no one else can get if I also believe that that driver is going to outperform. League adoption tool, super powerful.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts from you guys? We have no more questions, so we're good to end early. Unless you guys have any final feedback you want to give our new players.
It sounds like a lot of things going on. It's actually a lot simpler than it sounds.
For sure.
Pick your drivers, pick the ones you think you're going to outperform, where we have them ranked in particular, and I think you'll have a good time.
Yep. Invite your friends. It's the best way you could support the platform. It's also going to make your league a lot more fun. Also, if you're in one of those really large leagues with thousands of players, we really encourage everybody to start their own, invite a couple friends. I think the fantasy sports experience is best enjoyed with a couple close friends where, you know, you can have some healthy smack talk, maybe put some money on the line on the side. So we'd love if you would invite any friends to the product. And also, if you have others in your league that didn't make it today, maybe just remind them we have 2 more live shows this week, one tomorrow and then one on Thursday a little bit earlier. Same content, and we'll be live for Q&A. So we appreciate everybody showing up, and we're glad that you're here. We're excited for a fun season with IndyCar and look forward to seeing you all again.
Yep. Well, I'd say
tomorrow, tomorrow 4 Eastern,
yes.
1 Pacific, and then Thursday at 2 Eastern, which would be 11 Pacific.
Yep. And go into your league chat, tell all of your league mates you came here, found it helpful, and everyone else should come. And then go into the paddock for IndyCar and say, I watched the live show. It was so helpful. You all should go. The team is great at answering questions. Okay. And subscribe to our YouTube and turn notifications bell on. That's all I've got for you.
There you go. You got it in. All right. Well, on that note, we will end. Thank you, everybody, for joining, and we will see you soon. All right. We're good. Cool. That went well. I was a little worried at the start with how few questions. So,